In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
The values should be sacred. When you call them principles or values, there's an instant sense of them being sacrosanct. And if you're not going to treat them, so the creation of values is the beginning of the journey, but too often it's treated as the end of the journey. The creation, and who doesn't like it, right? It's inspiring. Everybody gets put up into a frenzy writing them, and then we put the plaques on the wall, and screensavers, and the T-shirts, and the mugs. We get all the accoutrement. We do all the training programs. Where the CEO comes on a video and talks about them, and all this, campaigning, and then we go back to life as usual. And that's where the work actually starts. But too often that's where it stops.
I'm Bajer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabajer.com/podcast. Hello, and welcome to episode 49. So I recently looked at the stats of this podcast, and it seems like we have listeners all over the globe, which is amazing and shows just how much interest there is in culture right now. And I hope that you are doing incredibly well wherever you are on this beautiful planet and whatever season you are experiencing at the moment. As you probably know, I'm based in Italy, and it's been proper autumn here for the past week or so, with beautiful, colorful leaves everywhere, but also, sadly, lots and lots of rain, which can be nice when you are indoors, but not so great when you have to walk the dog. So if you are in a similar or colder climate, I hope that you are somewhere warm and cozy with a mug of something delicious in your hand. And if not, I hope that you are outdoors enjoying the sun. Okay, so let me introduce you to my guest today, Ron Carucci. Ron is the co-founder and managing partner at Navalent. I first came across his work through his articles in the Harvard Business Review. And he is one of those thinkers that stop you in your tracks and who really challenge you and take you to places that you haven't considered before. He works with CEOs and executives who pursue transformational change for their organizations, and he has 30 years track record doing this. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I know that you will enjoy it too. There's just one thing that I want to mention. You will probably notice that the quality of this recording is slightly different. We had some technical difficulties, and in spite of our sound engineer trying to tackle them and do something better, you will still hear the recording occasionally skipping a bit. And I just hope that it won't distract you from what Ron has to share, because it's a really brilliant interview. Enjoy. So Ron, welcome to Culture Lab. I'm very excited to have you with us today.
Aga, it's so great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for making the time to do this. And before we start, I just want to ask you to briefly introduce yourself to our listeners.
Yeah, so I'm the co-founder and managing partner of a boutique consulting firm called Navalent, and we spend our days with senior leaders of all kinds of organizations, large ones, global ones, startup ones, who are pursuing some type of transformational change, whether that be major growth spurts or they've hit a ditch and they're facing some challenges. But they've been challenged with having to create some type of significant change in their strategy or their organization or their leaders. And we accompany them on those journeys to help them either not hurt themselves or make sure they realize the aspirations they're pursuing.
Yeah, it can be a bit of a treacherous road on this journey of transformational change, as a lot of our listeners know very well. So I'm really eager to talk to you about those things. But before we go there, would you be able to tell me about the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person? When you think about your childhood, what made Ron Ron?
Well, I grew up in New York, so right away there's a particular context around size and scale of the world and human achievement and um, uh, ambition. I grew up in a New York Italian family. I was the youngest of five, so you know, doing well in school, and at a time, in the '70s when um, there were lots of different cultural and economic forces shaping the Northeast of the United States. So, both my parents worked, and I was one of the first. We used to call them latchkey kids. The first, one of the first generation of kids who came home where both parents were not home. So, ambition was important. Achievement was important. I think in terms of reading and the arts were very important to me. Growing up early on, that's where I spent a lot of my time. So some sports, but academic achievement was important to me. One of the very first thought leaders I ever came across was Alvin Toffler, when he wrote Power Shift in the '90s, but also his more formidable works earlier than that. One of the first people who felt like he was a futurist and really could see trends changing. And the idea that we could get to the place where there was more change coming than we could actually tolerate was one of the very earliest, I think signs for me that change was important. I think when it comes to, my early days in organizations, I loved organizing human endeavor. I loved being the kid that organized the big fundraiser at school or organized a big event or party. I just loved watching what happened when people came together to collaborate and create something. So those are just a few.
Fascinating. So would you characterize yourself as an extrovert then?
No, not at all. Actually, I score pretty high on the introverted scale. So yeah, this is all learned. This is all learned behavior. I think many folks, this is a world that prizes extroversion. It's a world that prizes talking and not so much listening. And so, balancing how it is those of us who are more inclined to want to be quieter or be to ourselves, we have to develop a different set of social skills to be able to participate in a world that has long overprized extroversion.
Yeah. And it's fascinating that an introverted kid would have that fascination with, how do I organize others and how do I lead others? And it's I think, a common misconception that leaders or people who have this tendency from early childhood would be extroverts. But actually, when I talk to people, I discover very often that it's on the contrary, just like you. Introverts who are very reflective, and therefore they're really curious about human nature and what makes people tick, and they feel drawn to engaging in this role, perhaps of more of a servant leader and leading from the back, supporting people. So it's fascinating to hear that it's the case with you as well.
Yeah, one of my favorite interviews I got to do in my fourth column was with Susan Cain, who wrote the book Quiet, and some wonderful research on introversion and extroversion and how many closeted introverts are out pretending to be extroverts.
I know,
and how much the research, we value charisma, we value these characteristics that we associate with leadership, but actually how the research quite suggests the opposite, that introverts who are more thoughtful and reflective and self-aware, have over the long run more positive track records as leaders than extroverts do.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So I can see how those early influences would lead you on the path that you are today. And before we talk about what you do today, I just want to ask you a question about the coffee mug that you have in front of you right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because in our research, our production manager discovered that you have a special ritual that involves coffee mugs in the morning. Is that true?
It is true. Yes, it is.
So tell me about it. So what's the coffee mug that you are looking at the moment?
It's a mug of my local town here in Woodinville, from a local shop that's a sort of a iconic shop here in Woodinville, Washington, called Mobax, and it's got pictures of trees, and on it it's sort of a handmade imprinted mug. But the ritual is that, so if you go into the kitchen down in the conference room where my office is, in the conference room where we keep the coffee, all the coffee mugs are mugs that I've collected over many years from very different places in the world, from different experiences with certain people or certain trips, certain parts of the world. And so when I begin my day, this is how I begin my day with gratitude. I make sure that each one of these mugs, to me, holds a memory, holds a special place, or it holds a special person in my life who has been important to me. And it reminds me to start my day remembering that the story's not all about me, that there's a much bigger story that I'm part of, and to remember that others have been part of that as well, and to think about them with gratitude, and to think about them and wish them well for the day. And rather than be, immediately go into a day into my own inbox, or my own, stressors, or my own frustrations, or my own hopes, to step back and think about the world as a little bit bigger. So every morning I get to sort of pick a mug, and or sometimes the mug picks me. Sometimes I'll look in the cabinet and I'll spot one and instantly realize that's the one I should have my coffee with today. And it's just a way to spend a few minutes. Yeah, it's just a way to spend a few minutes starting the day thinking about something other than yourself. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that, the way you integrated that gratitude practice into your daily coffee ritual. I think a lot of people try to find those rituals, especially in the morning, to sort of set them up for a good, successful day. So I'm always curious what people do at the beginning of the day. And when we found this piece of information, I thought, wow, this is fascinating. I need to ask him about that. But mugs are not the only collection that you have. We've also discovered that you have a doorknob collection. Is that true as well?
It is. Gosh, you guys did your homework.
Yeah.
So there is these three jars in my office of antique door knockers and skeleton keys and doorknobs from, some of them are hundreds of years old. I began by creating these sort of, they're almost like little miniature art installations for friends of mine. People who are involved in opening doors for others, people who are involved in investing themselves into the lives of others in some form, whether that's in a healing way, or a coaching or guiding way, or a mentoring way. And it was my way of honoring, or one of my mentor who's been in education for 40 years, I made one for her. So I've probably made, I don't know, half a dozen of these for other people. And I go to these, I go around to these antique shops and salvage shops and places where you have all these, from many, many different eras. And the symbolism is that, life has many open doors. And part of our job in the world is to open doors for others. And also to remember that, there were lots of doors that came before us. And if I think about the thousands and thousands of hands that have touched these doorknobs over the hundreds of years, that, we're all part of a much bigger story, and we're all here to help open a door for somebody. And it's a wonderful way to remind ourselves of the privilege it is to open doors for other people. And so anyway, after making about 6 of them, I thought, I want one for me. I want one in my office. So I made this big giant one, like this, probably a glass. So they sit in these glass cylinders, so you can see all the way through and see the layers of doorknobs on them. And the vessel I chose.
Well, listen, now you will have to take a picture of that, and we'll post it in the show notes, because I'm sure that the listeners are really curious to see it.
Well, so the first vessel I chose was probably about 5 feet tall. And I didn't really do the engineering to know, could a vessel that tall handle the weight of that many glass and brass and metal doorknobs? And unfortunately, after about 3 or 4 months, it shattered and blew up. And that was sad to me. But it sort of became this moment of, I'll show them. So I went and got 3 smaller ones that my wife then bought, these little turntables, like you put in your kitchen cabinet. You can turn to find your spices. So we put them on these 3 turntables. So now there's a collection of 3 of them on my table, and they all turn. So you can turn them and see them from all sides. So I decided, well, if I couldn't have one, then I would have 3.
I love that. And there's a reason that I ask about these objects, because I'm really fascinated about how culture expresses itself in artifacts, and how those artifacts like mugs or the doorknobs can prompt people to think about certain things and feel in a certain way, like feel gratitude or think about opening doors for others. And I'm sure that it has an impact on how you behave as well, right? Because it has this meaning. And every single time you look at that, you're thinking, okay, opening doors, creating opportunities. Do you feel that indeed your behavior daily is influenced by just looking at these objects?
Well, I think on some days I hope it is. Some days I'm sure it doesn't look like it is at all. But I walk through a little bit of a library area where all my books are down the hallway to get to the conference room where the coffee is, and I remember reading some of the books. So I think I try to get to the fact that there are lots of reminders around me. There are lots of rituals around me and practices around me that if I'm mindful enough to think about them, and can call me back to a set of principles in my life, or call me back to, my office is chock full of all kinds of photographs of my family and my friends and my colleagues, and so seeing their faces, but there are days I'm sure I walk past them all in a daze, or past them all in a huff on the way to get things done, and I don't allow them to call me to be who I say I want to be. So I think that the artifacts in the world can be wonderful nudges and wonderful guardrails to keep us in a lane of principles. But we're humans, right? And we have the wonderful capacity of breaking those guardrails and going outside those lines. And we lose perspective, or when we get frustrated, or when we get overly focused on one thing, or overly self-involved with things that are troubling us. It's easy for those wonderful signals that are all around us all the time to lose their meaning and lose their power.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Organizational culture. It's been getting a lot of coverage recently, right? And I find this frustrating because it's been mostly for the wrong reasons. It has been discussed mainly in the context of major scandals like Volkswagen, Wells Fargo, Uber, or the college admission scandal in the US. So I'm curious, Ron, what is your take on the reasons why we see so much dishonesty in the corporate world?
So, as we chatted about in our earlier chat, Aga, I recently did some research, a 15-year longitudinal study that included about 3,300 interviews of people to better understand what is it that will predict dishonest behavior, people lying or withholding the truth. I think we both share the frustration that culture is often misunderstood, and the role it plays and how it's shaped is often painfully misunderstood and superficially understood in the world. And so when you can't figure out the answer to a problem in an organization, you just sort of throw it in the culture bucket. It's the same with communications, right? Oh, we need better communications. Well, we can't explain some misstep in a leader's world. We just say they didn't communicate well. It has become a superficially difficult, easy answer to things that are far more complicated. Culture is so sacred and so special that I wish people would spend more time learning to understand what it really is and what it's not. So we found 4 forces, 4 things that would predict whether or not people lie or withhold the truth. The first was what we call strategic identity, meaning every organization has statements it makes about itself. It has a mission or a values or a purpose or a brand promise. And the extent to which people believe these statements to be untrue, or there to be hypocrisy in what you say and what you do, the extent to which people's own individual purpose is disconnected from who you say you are, so they feel no sense of connection to it, the extent to which that clarity is not there, you are 3 times more likely to have people lie or withhold the truth. Because when we don't know who we are, we make things up. The second was accountability, and whether or not there was people perceive justice in how you how you measure contribution, not how you compensate it, but how you measure it. So if people perceive the way their contributions are measured or assessed to be unfair, you're 4 times more likely to have people lie and withhold the truth. Because once I have to now embellish my contributions and I have to hide my mistakes in order to feel like I'm seen for who I am and what I can do. The third was governance. So if there's no forums for which the truth can be told, there's no gatherings of people around the right tables and the right meetings to have honest conversations about what's happening, and the truth has to go underground, you're 3.5 times more likely to have people lie and withhold truth, because I have to rely on gossip and rumors and other sources of information if there's no place for the truth to be told. And lastly, rivalry. If you have unresolved conflicts at the borders of your organization, so between divisions, or the classic between sales and marketing, or between R&D and operations, if you have unresolved conflicts at your borders, where you have now dueling truths, where people are having to sort of one-up each other, you're 6 times more likely to have people lie and withhold the truth, because when we fragment the organization, we also fragment the truth.
Yeah. And what I find fascinating is that these factors, according to your study, are cumulative. Yeah. So you say that an organization afflicted with all 4 is 15 times more likely to end up in an integrity catastrophe, right?
Exactly right. So now you got this enormous problem. If you have any aspects of these areas in your organization that are unattended to, you just exponentiate the risk of people lying or withholding the truth in your organization.
So for our listeners who are thinking, wow, okay, so this is really serious, and maybe we need to look into whether we have enough clarity, whether our measurement of performance is what we need, and whether there's governance and those forums for people to tell the truth, and finally, whether there is enough cross-functional collaboration. Is there anything that people can do to first evaluate that, and then secondly start investing in these areas, so that they create this environment that basically enables honesty and culture of honesty?
And the thing that I hope people, what I've been trying to do as I present research and write about it in various forms, what I'm trying to say is, don't do this as for scandal avoidance, right? To keep yourself out of a black hole. Because the performance of these organizations, if your organization is more honest, if it's more authentic, and people have a greater sense of purpose in it, your performance is going to improve. Do it for that reason. Do it for the stakeholders that rely on you, your customers, your shareholders, your suppliers, your employees. That's the reason to do it. So, and there are very simple things. If you have mission and vision and value statements, make them part of your life. Have people talk about, where are you living up to them? Where are you not? Where are you departing from those messages? Where do you feel like your promises? It's human, right? We're all going to have times where it appears that we depart from who we say we are. The question is, what do you do about it? So embed those statements into your everyday practices, into your everyday conversations. When it comes to accountability, one of the questions I ask people when I start my talks, I ask them, how many of you have something in your organization called something like a QBR or an MBR, a quarterly business review or a monthly business review, some device where people come together every month or every quarter or some periodic basis. And in that meeting, the leaders will talk about what just happened in the last period and explain how things did or didn't go well, and they predict what's about to happen in the coming period. And most people raise their hand. We've got some mechanism that is meant to come together to talk about what's happening and to assess progress. And then I ask them, how many of you at least once during meetings think to yourself privately, this is such crap, but don't say anything? More than half the hands in the room go up. So what is it that makes the people in the front of the room feel like they have to say something other than what everybody believes to be true? They're not sociopaths, right? They're not all just psychotic liars. So ask yourself, what is it about our organization that has made it okay, or made this otherwise good leader feel like there's no other option but for him or her to say what they're saying? That's telling you that they have decided it's not safe to tell you what actually happened or what they actually believe is going to happen. And so then you have to ask yourself why. What has made it unsafe or unexpected for people to be honest about performance.
And what, in your experience, usually are the main reasons that it is unsafe in organizations?
Well, so you have leaders who put pressure on people to perform. You have leaders who have, punished people for underperforming, or they have said nothing, right? So you've not learned from mistakes. A lot of times, it's so interesting when I do some of our interviews, and people will say, "Oh, we could never tell the truth. We could never tell them that." And I say, "Well, how many people have you seen fired? How many people have you seen, really experience a consequence for it?" They can name no names, right? So a lot of times, the lack of safety is self-imposed. It's not actually the organization that has made it unsafe.
This is fascinating for me as well, because I've seen this in organizations to a great extent as well, where there is this assumption and no one really challenges that, yeah, of course you don't say those things, right? It's a CLM, career limiting move. Just, keep quiet. But actually, when you challenge people and when you inquire, okay, tell me last time something bad happened when someone spoke up, people can't really bring any memories of an event like that, right? Yeah, it's fascinating.
And so I think that then if you know that these are self-imposed shrouds, which I think the purpose behind it is I've justified not opening my mouth, I've justified not speaking the truth by this imposed risk, then talk about that. Right. So then you can bring that to the conversation to say, okay, how do you want to be? I wish every leader would simply ask their reports, how do you want to be held to account? How do you want me to talk about your contributions? How do you want to hear about places where you're falling short? How can I best acknowledge your contributions in a way that is honoring to you? Because one of the other questions I often ask people is, how many of you have ever received a compliment from your boss that you found offensive? And most of them have, because, with the best of intentions, our bosses say things that are insincere or uninformed. And then we also feel like our accomplishments have also not been understood. So the third area was governance, right? So if what company do you walk in and have people say, we love our meetings. Our meetings are great. They're so productive. They're efficient. We have great conversations. I learn a lot. And I leave feeling like we were honest. No one says that. So we all know that the way our organizations are governed, that we bring people together and allocate resources, are ineffective. So the problem is people are layering over this problem with technique, better agenda setting techniques, or better, beginning meetings of mindfulness, or having meetings standing up. They're doing all these meetings that are recurring in our organizations shouldn't be happening at all. So you can't fix a meeting that shouldn't be happening. The question is your governance structure designed to be a coherent and synchronized set of meetings where the right leaders are given the right decision rights to come together to make the right decisions with the right authority levels, and so they know what their charter is? And is it part of a broader governance distribution? If it's not, if it's just some task force that started years ago that hasn't stopped meeting and it's taken on a life of its own, you should shut it down. And so, you can assess the health of your governance. You can assess the health of your meeting cadence to see, are they the right people and do they have the right authority? Do they know what's expected of them? And then lastly, if you have border wars, if you've had, family feuds happening between, senior leaders, when two leaders are feuding, everybody knows it, right? They all tell us about it when we go in. So if there are feuds or border war or unresolved conflicts or tensions at critical seams of your organization, fix them. Hold people accountable for them, because they're almost always not just personality conflicts, right? So it's not just that sales and marketing don't get along. It's these measurement systems that measure different outcomes for them, and so you've created competing expected outcomes of them where they have to treat each other as rivals. It's not just that they don't get along. So dig deeper to understand, how are these conflicts systemic? How are these rivalries institutionalized? And how do we dismantle them so that people can cooperate and collaborate more effectively? So the great news is they're all, but you have to first decide you want to fix them. And before that, you have to first decide that you actually want to see them and acknowledge them.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that this piece about seeing those things is really fundamental, because very often it's under the surface, or people are so used to the way things are that they simply stop noticing. Is this thing about fish not being able to see water? I think when we exist and operate in an environment that we're very familiar with, we really start suffering from cultural blindness.
Yep.
So yeah, first step, absolutely start noticing and then decide and commit to fixing those issues. I love that. And so I think we've given our listeners a few ideas there of what they can do around those 4 areas. And you mentioned, when you talked about clarity and identity, you mentioned values. And I think that values are probably one of the most widely acknowledged aspects and drivers of organizational culture. It's probably safe to assume that the majority of our listeners work for a company that has an official statement of company values. And sadly, I think it's also probably safe to say that a large percentage of our listeners don't recall their company values, not to mention believing in them, right? or acting in alignment with them. So I want to ask you, Ron, what are the conditions that need to be present to prevent the misuse of corporate values?
Oh gosh, I love the question, Naga, because you and I think I remember in our earlier chat, both of us, like, I could see the veins popping out of our necks
Yeah.
virtually. It's such a frustrating. Well, don't write them down. Don't have values. You would be better off not having them, um, versus having them. Having them. And here's the thing that I think was painful in my research: the minute you create an environment of duplicity, what you are saying to people is duplicity is okay. And that makes it not just okay with our values, it makes it okay with anything. It is perfectly reasonable to say one thing and do another. Now you institutionalize duplicity. Well, the minute I now have decided that I cannot bring my whole self to work, in other words, I have to be something other than who I say I am, do we have any wonder why employee engagement scores are what they are around the world? Why 70% of the workforce is disengaged, or why 50% say they lack the purpose? It's because they have themselves at home. So the danger, the absolute danger of constructing a set of values, for whatever reason you cosmetically believe you need to have them, is so destructive. And there's two, of all the forces of destruction I've seen, there are 2 unique ones. One is when those values are purely aspirational. In other words, when you create a set of values that look, so that now I read this and I can't locate myself in the story at all. So now I'm confused. But the worst one is when I construct a set of values that are meant to be corrective, meaning that I'm now going to put integrity as a value when there's been a scandal, or I'm going to put speed as a value when we're too slow to market, or I'm going to put diversity and inclusion as a value when there's been too many lawsuits. The minute you create a value as a weapon to correct people, the last thing that's going to happen is anybody's behavior changing, because everybody will know why it's there. So the values should be sacred. When you call them principles or values, there's an instant sense of them being sacrosanct. And if you're not going to treat them, so the creation of values is the beginning of the journey, but too often it's treated as the end of the journey. The creation, and who doesn't like it, right? It's inspiring. Everybody gets whipped up into a frenzy writing them, and then we put the plaques on the wall, and screensavers, and the T-shirts, and the mugs. We get all the accoutrement. We do all the training programs, where the CEO comes out a video and talks about them, and all this, campaigning, and then we go back to life as usual. And that's where the work actually starts. But too often that's where it stops. And so if you're not going to go do the hard work for years and years and years, the hard work to keep yourself aligned to those values, to the place where they become normalized and institutionalized, and you're not going to embed them in your strategy work, in how you allocate resources, in how you assess performance, in how you hire people, in how you share information with people. If you're not going to embed them deep into, you are so much better off not even writing them down.
Yeah, totally. And I really want our listeners to hear that. First of all, I loved what you've said about institutionalizing duplicity by just stating values that are not being lived, because this is actually what is happening. And I think a lot of organizations don't realize that. And I think then there is this practical question. Okay, so what happens if we do feel like we need some aspirational values, maybe even corrective values, because as you say, we've had some issues and we know that we will have to change if we want to win in the market. So as you said in your example, maybe we were slow to the market and we now need to feel like we need to be more, externally focused and customer focused. So what would you advise our listeners to? Would you advise they start working on those principles without stating them officially first, so that it becomes part of the organizational DNA first, and then make a big statement? How would you approach that?
Well, that's a great question, Aga. And I think the first thing is to do is to be honest about why you are slow, right? So, to do a deep examination, a deep and honest examination about, are there too many decision-making layers? If people are too internally focused and not on customers, what's drawing their attention in? Are there too many competing priorities? Is there fragmentation at the places? So you think about who owns the customer relationship and the customer journey. It's some combination of sales, marketing, customer service, and your customer insights people, right? So how well do those four organizations come together to work together? Well, let's just even start with the conversation. Do they even ever come together to talk about customers and the experience they're providing them? Do they see themselves as four parts of one thing and do it like that? So a deep examination of what is shaping I tell my clients all the time, your organization is perfectly designed to get the outcomes you're getting. So if you're getting highly insulated, bad customer behavior, it's because that's what you're designed to get. Putting a big poster on the wall saying we're obsessed over customers. I had in one interview I did for the research, it was so painful. This customer service rep was sitting in their call center, and a big giant poster on the wall in the call center where you have like 80, 90, 100 people sitting at the same time taking calls. We obsess over our customers. They're the most important part of our life. We treat them like family, blah, 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 right? So as these little reminders. But meanwhile, the measurement of how long they stayed on the call, how quickly they were expected to get off the call, how they had a state of the script, how they could deviate from the script, and how they had to escalate problems and not help them, and how they would how the customer's behavior would irritate them because here they're staring at one set of principles, but their boss is breathing over their neck to stay on script and get off the call, and they get dinged in their own measurements for staying on a call too long. That is absolute cruelty. That is being so cruel to people. And it's interesting. You said something before about companies don't even realize that they're creating duplicity. And I'm so curious. What's your take on why? How is it they could? I mean, I'm sure. Hey, like hypocrites out of our people. But how could you not know? Like, is it that do you think they just believe that? Well, I'm living them in my mind, so everybody else must be living them too. Why do you think that they can't see that?
I think that in my experience, to your question, why this might be happening, one of the reasons that I've noticed is that there's definitely this positive intention there. But at the same time, there is a lot of pressure and a lot of focus on short-term results. And organizations get seduced by the shortcuts to the results, the quarterly results, or even monthly results that they are required to present and produce. And so that's one of the reasons that I see why this duplicity is so prevalent in organizations. How about you? What have you seen?
I'm often baffled. But as you and I are systemic thinkers, so we walk in and we see the artifacts of hypocrisy immediately. And so I think part of it is this cosmetic thing that, everybody's supposed to have mission, vision, values. And of course, what's so funny is when you ask people, what's the difference between a vision and a mission? They can't tell you. So everybody's supposed to have statements. So because it's like we should all have a car. We have a car. It's become this cosmetic expectation of, well, if you're a company, you have these things. People just don't give it a thought. It's like this cosmetic device that we're supposed to have, so we just get one. If you look at most companies' values, it looks like they Google them, right? They could be anybody's values. And so, company integrity, teamwork, service, humility, respect. I mean, the same ones just keep getting recycled. So anyway, it baffles me that leaders don't. What I get troubled by is they don't realize the destruction of it. How dangerous it is to have words that you're not perceived to live by.
I love that, because it's a really clear message that it's really, truly dangerous. I think that this is something that a lot of leaders don't realize. So as you say, maybe they see it as something cosmetic, just beautifying and making things look nicer, and a nice sort of public relations exercise. But they don't realize that this actually comes with a cost. And that cost very often is much bigger than they anticipate. I also want to comment on what you've mentioned before, because you talked a little bit about training. And I recently had a chat with an HR director, and he tried to understand what exactly we do to help companies evolve their culture. And so I talked to him a little bit about our process and methodology, and I mentioned the importance of focus and clarity, and of identifying the keystone change and the most powerful levers for culture evolution. And he kind of cut me off and jumped in and said, okay, so when you identify the levers, what do you suggest as the next step? Training? And it's he's not alone. I get this question all the time. I think that especially in HR, a lot of HR professionals are still very attached to this idea that we will train our people. And when we train our people, the behavioral patterns in our organization will change. So as you say, instead of looking at the systemic issues, they just try to put the Band-Aid of training on really important issues in the organizations. And we talked a little bit about why this happens. But I know that you've done some work around identifying when is the right time to invest in training and when it's not the right time to invest in training. So would you like to talk to our listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, it's I saw your post this morning and thank you for sharing my article with that post. I smiled and I rolled my eyes. I'm like, oh, here we go. In the article I write, a very similar story. Somebody came to me and said, our decision-making processes are too slow. Can you come and train our people to be more entrepreneurial so they make faster decisions? And I said, well, so you determined that you believe the issue is a lack of skill, because training is a great solution when the issue is a lack of skill. But I said, can I come and just sniff around to see perhaps why it is that people. So what we learned was that there were like layers and layers and layers of approvals required for the simplest decisions, like travel expenses. There was no governance structure. So people who you said you expected to make decisions were never in the meetings where the decisions were made. People also lower down in the organization where you wanted to push the decision making did not see themselves as decision makers. So you had so many other obstacles in the way. I said, there may be, in fact, for the people you would like to start making decisions, a skill gap, but that's the least of your problems right now in terms of clearing the way to push decision making those where it keeps getting sucked up to the top. And the response was, yeah, we'll get to all of that. But if we think we start with the workshop, it'll help get things going.
I love that. I mean, I don't love that. I hate that when it happens, but it's so typical.
And I'm like, well, I can't help you, right? So I can't if you're determined to do a workshop. If you think everybody wants a silver bullet, right? Everybody thinks if I sit in a workshop, I'll learn something. First of all, learning is a consequence of thinking. It's not a consequence of teaching. Just because somebody's dispensing content on a video or on the internet or in a room somewhere, it doesn't mean anybody's learning anything. It means they got 3 hours away from their cubicle. Secondly, everybody wants it to be a silver bullet, right? They want it to be we spray and pray and hope for the best. And so now, even places where training could be helpful, you're not even doing it well. So, training is a wonderful device. It's a very powerful device to help people become better in their skills or their knowledge bases to do their jobs. But if you, how many millions of times have we all heard people say, I finished the training, it was good workshop, I went back to my job and nothing changed. I didn't even use it. Where especially with the most common culprit is leadership training, right? We send people away for a week to go learn how to be better leaders. They come back and nothing changes. And that's because you're depositing this new set of skills and this new set of behaviors into an environment that can't encourage it or support it. In fact, most of the environment probably contradicts it. And so how is it people are supposed to apply what you've asked them to apply when everything around them is encouraging the opposite behavior? So it's training is not the silver bullet we all want it to be.
Yeah, it's so true. And so I'm curious, in this specific situation with that specific client who wanted to train their people on being more entrepreneurial. If you had a free rein and could do anything for that client, where would you start?
I would have started with doing a complete audit of key decisions they wanted the top leaders to be done. And I would have done a clear sort of tracing of the pathway. Where does the decision start and end? And made sure we designed the jobs and designed governance and designed roles to include where we wanted those decisions placed. I would strip them out of the place and embed them someplace else and make sure that the middle or the bottom of the organization where you wanted them could hold them. And once I designed the organization and the pathway to hold those decisions, then I would ask, are the people who now in whose pathway these decisions are, do they have the skill to contribute? Do they have the analytical skills to look at data? Do they have the conflict resolution skills to deal with the conflict when people disagree? Do they have the ability to make trade-offs? I look at the skill sets and then I would say, okay, now we've taken care of the other systemic areas to move these decisions to a different place. Now we can address the skill gaps if there are any.
And we both know that very often this conversation with organizations, it's quite difficult because they will reach out for help, being focused on a symptom like lack of entrepreneurship or lack of customer focus. And somehow they're not prepared to go deep and really do that audit and do the work that matters. And I think we can all relate to that. I think one of the factors is fear, but I suppose there are many other factors there as well. And again, I'm curious, in your experience, Ron, I know that you've worked with a lot of organizations over 4 continents, I think, and more than 20 countries. So what do you think are the main reasons that our clients, the organizations that we work with, shy away from really looking at the real issue and addressing the real issue?
I think people want to believe that the problems, the pain they're facing are quicker. I mean, we all go to the hospital and the urgent care. The point you made in your post this morning, I got right, which is why, if knowledge was the answer, why do people still smoke or don't exercise, right? So I think we all want problems to be simpler than they are. We want fixes to come faster than they can. I think it's, these are hard problems. And the reality is that once you begin to acknowledge the systemic realities of where these problems might reside, you now have to reorganize your entire understanding and belief system, right? Things you've always believed about your company or your department or your role or your importance now become questioned. And so I think unfortunately, we don't teach people how to do systemic problem solving, how to look at whole systems to understand where problems originate. And so it can be I think it's very intimidating to know what does it stop? And so, of course, every systemic problem you fix. So if we had fixed systemically that decision-making in that one set of decisions, I now, in the places where those decisions used to reside, I've now created new conflicts and new problems. Because if one set of people used to get their sense of importance for making those choices and no longer have those decisions, are they now going to feel out of place? Are they now going to feel less important? Are they now going to fight to keep their involvement? Are they now going to resist? Right? So you solve one systemic problem, you potentially create others. And if you're not ready for that reality, the ripple effect of the fact that these organizations are living systems, then it's just much easier to want to put a Band-Aid on it and hope for the best. And I've heard leaders, I'm sure you have too, admit it. I know it's a quick fix. We'll get to the bigger solution later, but right now we just need something quick.
Yeah, I did hear that, of course.
And they think because I've admitted it, that makes it okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe actually the only kind of training that you would recommend is training in systems thinking, right? Especially to our leaders.
Well, I think we should start in MBA school. They should start, way back when they're getting their MBAs is when we should start that process and getting people to think holistically about organizations and about themselves.
Yeah, totally. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. It was really, really interesting. And I would like us to move now to the rapid fire question section. And that's a section of this interview where I will ask you 5 questions in rapid succession, and we only have 2 minutes for these questions.
Okay.
All right. Are you
I'll
up
do
for
my
it?
best.
Okay, let's go for it. So first, how do you define organizational culture?
When you this is things work around here. That's the culture.
Mm-hmm. And what are the signs that the company culture needs some work, or perhaps even a major overhaul?
You're slow to execute your strategy. Everybody's saying there's too many priorities. Everybody's saying I don't trust my boss. People are saying I can't get a job, or I'm bored at work, or people are constantly assuming that somebody else is out to get them.
Are there any companies that you admire for their culture? And if yes, why?
So AbbVie is a biopharma company in the world, and we're a spinoff of Abbott, and they have some work to do on their culture, but everybody cares about patients there. You can really tell that people are deeply committed to the well-being of their patients, and it's inspiring to see.
Wonderful. And what books on culture or on leadership would you recommend? And I definitely would recommend our listeners reach out and check out your books. But apart from your books, what do you read when you want to learn about leadership or culture?
Oh gosh! So one of my favorite books that I think should be required reading for the whole planet is by David White, called "Crossing the Unknown Sea." It's a beautiful book about work and how it's a reflection of our life. I think what else have I read on culture? I think if you go back, it's an old classic book, but Cutter's book "Corporate Culture and Performance" I thought was a culture and performance. I think I'm just looking over at my bookshelf to see what's on there now.
Yeah.
Interestingly, there were parts of Ray Dalio's new book called Principles. Parts of it I thought some of it I felt like was a little bit of it wasn't sure what book it wanted to be, but for the most part, I thought there was some good practical ways of shaping honest and open behavior in a culture. I think Tasha Urich's book, Insight, is a great book about self-awareness. I think if we all start with ourselves, it's a great way to bring a better self to work. So those are just a few.
Fantastic. So we'll post the links in the show notes for our listeners. And so finally, what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a sort of culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
So I think if everybody were to simply go pick 4 or 5 people in their life they trusted, sort of their own little personal board directors, people they could confidently know would tell them the truth, no matter what question they asked, and ask them 2 questions. One, ask them, based on what you observed in my life, if my life were to be a billboard, what do you think the message would say? What do you think I stand for? And the second question is, under what conditions do you see me not living up to those principles? And then pick people who you know will tell you the truth, because there are times you're not living up to them. You can definitely be sure other people are talking about those to you, your spouse or your family or your friends or your colleagues or your teammates or your direct reports if you lead people. So get in on the conversation, and then have that same conversation once every 4 months.
Yeah, love that. Because you never get there, right? It's a journey. And so you need to check in regularly on those things. Love that. What a great advice. So if I ask you to recommend someone as the next guest on the podcast, either a person who has been successful in consciously and intentionally cultivating a culture that supports them in achieving a meaningful purpose or vision, or a thinker, management or leadership thinker with something interesting to say about culture, do you have anyone in mind?
Well, I think 2 come to mind. One, if you haven't already interviewed him, he's just won a big award for culture, Chester Elton. So he wrote the book All In, and he's a wonderful, wonderful man and has a lot to offer. And also Dory Clark. If you haven't interviewed her, she really has help, has a wonderful message of self-empowerment.
Yeah, I've been speaking with Dory, and I think she's coming on the podcast as a guest. So I'm very excited to speak to her.
Oh, great.
So yeah, fantastic recommendations. Thank you very much. So if you were
Yeah.
to leave our listeners with a thought, something, a takeaway, what would it be? How would you like to close this conversation?
I think something my mentor told me, early in my career. She said, "Nothing in life is irrevocable except death."
Mm-hmm.
And I think we spend too much the shot you can get. You get do-overs, and so don't let the environment around you determine how you choose to live your life. Cultivate a set of principles and live by them, even if that means you might ruffle some feathers. Be true to yourself, and take the shots. That don't hang back and wonder what. Don't get yourself to a place in life where suddenly you're wondering what could have happened or would have happened had I tried.
Yeah, I love that. Wonderful. So if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work or get in touch with you, what are the best places for them to go to?
Come visit us at Navalent, Navalent.com. We got some wonderful videos, and we have a quarterly magazine you can sign up to receive for free on all kinds of aspects of culture and leadership and self-awareness and self-development. We have some great white papers, and we have a free downloadable book. So if you have some major change to lead in your culture, we have a free ebook called Leading Transformation. You can get it at navalent.com/transformation. Also find me on Twitter at Ron Carucci.
Fantastic. And I've downloaded the book myself, and it's very, very useful. So I'm going to post a link to this as well in the show notes so that our listeners can benefit from that. Ron, thank you so much for this conversation. This was awesome. And I'm sure that we've all learned a lot from what you've shared with us. So many takeaways from this conversation. Difficult work to do. But as you said, I think that, unfortunately, the important work is not done with band-aids. It's usually done with those deep dives and the difficult stuff that we need to do. So I'd encourage everyone to pick maybe one area where you believe you can benefit from, your team can benefit from, and just have a deep dive, as you said, understand, first of all, what's going on, why it's going on, and then start addressing those issues in a systemic way. That would be my takeaway from this interview.
I'll get right back at you. Thanks for all your good work on the world, and thanks for all you're doing to help the world understand culture better. I appreciate you. I appreciate it a lot. It was great to be with you.
Thank you so much, Ron. Thank you. It was wonderful speaking to you. I'm Aga Bajer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art Director, Emily Spencer.
Aaron Scott, Content Editor.
Sound Producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. If you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, The Culture Lab Insider, go to www.agabajer.com/podcast and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. That's www.agabajer.com/podcast. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. Now, this is an incredibly special moment for me. There are very few people who have influenced my thinking as much as Seth Godin. I read all of his books, participated in a few of his seminars, and he played a major role in my decision to leave the corporate world and to strike out on my own. In fact, the idea for this very podcast was born during one of his seminars, and so now here I am, 2 years later, making a ruckus of my own, helping companies spark a cultural revolution. For those of you who don't know Seth, he is the author of 19 books that have been bestsellers around the world and have been translated into more than 35 languages. He's also the founder of the Alt MBA and the Marketing Seminar, which are online workshops that have transformed the work of thousands of people, including my own. He writes about the post-industrial revolution, the way ideas spread, marketing, quitting, leadership, and most of all, changing everything. In addition to his writing and his speaking, Seth has founded several companies, including Yoyodyne and Squido. His blog, which you can find by typing Seth into Google, is one of the most popular in the world. And in 2018, he was inducted into the Marketing Hall of Fame. When I reached out to Seth and invited him to be a guest on the Culture Lab podcast, he said, absolutely, with great pleasure, but I will be your 50th guest. With a bi-monthly release schedule, that meant that I would have to wait for this interview for 1.5 years. And boy, was it worth it. You'll find out yourself soon. But in the meantime, here is a short preview of our conversation where Seth talks about culture being both global and local, and how important that local aspect is for the experience people have at work. Have a listen.
In my experience, human beings tend to ignore mission statements and focus really a great deal on where is my spot in the hierarchy and how in the immediate circle around me of 5 or 10 people do I gain more trust, authority, and connection with that group of people. So it may be that Starbucks has a mission of caffeinating and connecting people who woke up this morning uncaffeinated and disconnected. But that's not what drives the barista who goes to Starbucks to work today. She is driven by, how does it feel to be in this particular Starbucks today? Or if I think about my friends at Acumen, which is one of the most important nonprofits, most of the people at Acumen do not spend most of their day making decisions solely based on their manifesto, which is one of the most beautiful mission statements I've read. They're making decisions based on that immediate circle around them and how will interacting with them make them feel like people like us. So that's why culture is important, because culture is this persistent, low-grade current that is running through everything we do. And it's local, it's not just global.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Lab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.